Consider the hands. It is a November evening in 1855, and in a dim first-floor room at the Talbot Arms Inn, in the small Staffordshire town of Rugeley, a pair of hands is at work. They are fine hands, a surgeon's hands, with clean, trimmed nails and steady fingers that do not tremble. They move with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to delicate operations. The lancing of abscesses, the setting of broken bones, the gentle palpation of a feverish brow. Just now, these hands are rolling small white pills between thumb and forefinger, shaping them with the care one might lavish upon pearls. On the bed, a young man writhes. His name is John Parsons Cook. He is 28 years old, a former solicitor turned racecourse speculator, and at this moment he is in considerable pain. His stomach has been in revolt for days. His throat burns. His limbs ache with a deep, nauseating fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure. He has come to Rugeley from the Shrewsbury races, where his mare Polestar galloped to a handsome victory and earned him somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000. He should be celebrating. Instead, he is dying. The man with the steady hands sits at his bedside. He is the local doctor. He is also Cook's friend. He has been attending to him with unfailing devotion, bringing broth, administering medicines, sitting up through the long watches of the night. His name is William Palmer, and when he smiles, which is often, his face radiates such warmth that one instinctively trusts him. The chambermaids trust him. The landlady trusts him. Cook trusts him. The pills are ready. The doctor holds them out on his open palm. Now imagine yourself in that bed. You are ill, frightened, far from home, and the only person at your side is a physician, your companion, a man whose laughter you have shared over whiskey at a dozen racecourses. He offers you medicine. His expression is kind. His voice is reassuring. Would you take the pills from those hands? Of course you would. Anyone would. John Parsons Cook took them, and those hands killed him. But here is what matters more than the killing itself. Those same hands had, for years, delivered babies in the cottages around Rugeley. They had stitched wounds and set fractures and held the pulse of the dying with professional compassion. They had cradled the doctor's own children. They had stroked the necks of racehorses before the starting bell. They had clasped his wife's fingers in the parish church on their wedding day. And those same hands, if the whispered suspicions of an entire nation were to be believed, had poisoned not merely John Parsons Cook, but perhaps his own wife, his brother, his mother-in-law, and at least one unfortunate acquaintance who made the grave error of accepting an invitation to stay the night. This is not the story of a murderer's hands. It is the story of how a healer's hands became a killer's hands, and of the terrible, silent moment when the one became the other. No one saw it happen, perhaps not even the man himself. But to understand that transformation, we must travel back 31 years, to a summer's day in 1824, when a child was christened in a market town, and no one present could have guessed that the infant with the angelic face would grow into a man whose surname would become a byword for poison across the length and breadth of England. The town of Rugeley sits in the rolling farmland of central Staffordshire, roughly midway between Birmingham and Stoke-on-Trent. In the 1820s, it was a modest settlement of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 souls, a high street, a parish church, a cattle market, a scattering of coaching inns, and the slow brown waters of the River Trent nearby. Everyone knew everyone else's business. A man's reputation was his currency. The arrival of a new doctor or the departure of a bankrupt farmer could furnish conversation for a month. Here, on the 6th of August 1824, William Palmer was born, the fifth of 7 children in a household that had money but not quite the standing to match it. His father, Joseph Palmer, was a timber merchant who had done remarkably well for himself, though the nature of his prosperity invited quiet speculation. There were murmurings that old Joseph had enriched himself through the pilfering of timber from the estates of the Marquis of Anglesey. Whether the rumours were true or merely envious gossip, the result was the same. By the time of William's birth, Joseph Palmer had amassed a fortune estimated at some £70,000, a staggering sum, equivalent to 8 or 9 million today. Yet wealth alone did not purchase respect. The Palmers were new money in a world that valued old. They were not gentry. They had no coat of arms, no ancestral manor, no pew at the front of the church reserved by ancient custom. They were, in the unforgiving taxonomy of provincial English society, parvenus, tolerated, perhaps envied, but never quite admitted to the inner circle. Young William absorbed this distinction early. The gap between what his family possessed and what it was permitted to claim would shape his hunger for status as surely as any schoolroom lesson. Joseph Palmer did not live to see what his fortune would do to his children. He died when William was roughly 12 years old, the exact year uncertain, placed variously in 1836 or 37. What survived with perfect clarity was the money and the woman who controlled it. Mary Palmer, née Bentley, was formidable. When her adolescent son came asking for money, as adolescent sons do, she would fix him with a look that could curdle milk at 20 paces. "You'll have what you need, William, and not a penny more." She was not cruel. She was cautious, the caution of a widow who understood that £70,000, divided among 7 children, could evaporate with alarming speed if discipline were not maintained. She was right to worry. Several of her children would prove spectacularly incapable of managing money. Walter, William's brother, would drink himself into ruin. The Palmer fortune, assembled by Joseph through means that may not bear close examination, would be scattered within a generation. But all of that lay ahead. In the early 1840s, William Palmer was simply a boy with charm, a ready smile, and a restless appetite for something that Rugeley could not provide. He was not a brilliant student at the local grammar school. What he possessed was a quality more useful than scholarship, the ability to make people like him. He was affable, amusing, attentive. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel as though you were the most important person in the room. At 17, his family arranged for him to be apprenticed to a firm of chemists in Liverpool, a stepping stone towards a career in medicine. The apprenticeship lasted only months. Young William was entrusted with a sum of money, £5 or thereabouts, to forward to a client of the firm. The money never arrived. When the proprietor, a Mr. Evans, confronted him, the boy's response was a masterpiece of adolescent evasion. "There's been a misunderstanding, sir. I can explain." A misunderstanding is when you're a shilling short. When £5 vanishes, that's theft. Get out. He was dismissed. His mother paid what was owed and brought her son home. No charges were pressed. William returned to Rugeley without visible shame. He had learned something important, though not the lesson his mother intended. That money could make problems disappear, and that a confident manner could postpone the moment of reckoning almost indefinitely. There is another incident from these early years that deserves mention, though it rests upon the shifting ground of retrospective suspicion. Some years after Palmer's execution, stories circulated about a man named George Aberley, a local acquaintance whom the young Palmer had allegedly challenged to a drinking contest at the Lamb and Flag public house. Aberley died that very night. Some versions of the tale added a further detail, that Palmer had taken an interest in Aberley's wife, and that the drinking match was less a wager than a stratagem. No inquest returned a verdict of foul play. No evidence of poison was adduced. The story may well be nothing more than gossip, coloured by the knowledge of what Palmer would later become. But it lingers, a shadow, a premonition, the faintest pencil mark on a page that would later be written in ink. In 1842 or thereabouts, Palmer left Rugeley for London. He enrolled first at Stafford Infirmary and then proceeded to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, one of the great teaching institutions of the capital. He obtained his qualification as a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1846. The London of the 1840s was a city of silk top hats and open sewers, of gaslit theatres and cholera-ridden slums. In the anatomy theatres of St. Bartholomew's, students dissected cadavers by candlelight, their nostrils filled with the sweet, cloying stench of preservation fluid. The memory of Burke and Hare, the Edinburgh body snatchers who had murdered 16 people to supply fresh corpses, was barely 2 decades old, and the profession of medicine still carried about it a faint whiff of the charnel house. Here the young surgeon first handled strychnine, not as a poison, not yet, but as a medicine. In small doses, strychnine was widely prescribed as a tonic for the nerves. In larger doses, it was a devastatingly effective rat poison, sold freely over the counter of any chemist's shop. Palmer learned to weigh it, to compound it, to understand its effects upon the human body. He knew that 3 grains were sufficient to kill a grown man. He knew it was odorless and almost tasteless. And he knew that once absorbed, it was fiendishly difficult to detect in the tissues of the dead. This knowledge was part of his professional education. The terrible irony is that the same training that equipped him to heal was precisely what equipped him to kill. Between the surgeon and the poisoner, there is no wall, only a choice. In 1846, the newly qualified surgeon returned to Rugeley with his diploma, his easy manner, and a mounting appetite for the pleasures of the racecourse. He opened his practice in a house on Market Street, directly opposite the Talbot Arms Inn. A small brass plate beside the door, a waiting room on the ground floor, consulting rooms and family quarters above. Within a year, he was one of the most popular men in Rugeley. Within 2, he would be married. By 22, William Palmer possessed everything a successful country surgeon required: a diploma, a winning manner, deft hands, and what appeared to be a complete absence of moral scruple. He lacked only one thing: a wife with money. Anne Thornton was 20 years old when she encountered the young doctor, a quiet, gentle, rather pretty young woman from a family of some means. Her father, Colonel William Brooks, had served in India. Her mother came from comfortable stock. The family was respectable and, crucially, possessed of money. But Anne's life had not been untouched by sorrow. Her father had taken his own life in 1834 when she was 7 years old. She grew up in the long shadow of that act, a fatherless girl in a society that viewed suicide as both a sin and a scandal, learning early the art of silence and acceptance. It was a training that would serve her in her marriage, though not in the way anyone might have wished. Their courtship was conventional. Palmer was charming. Anne was receptive. Whether he loved her admits no certain answer. He was capable of warmth. But the arithmetic of Anne's fortune suggests that affection and avarice were tangled together from the start, like two threads in a single rope. "Miss Brooks, forgive me, you've dropped your glove." "Thank you, Dr. Palmer." Nothing remarkable. A commonplace exchange of Victorian courtesy, a young man retrieving a fallen glove, their fingers briefly touching. But Palmer already knew to the nearest pound what Anne Brooks was worth. They married on the 7th of October 1847 at the Church of St. Nicholas in Abbots Bromley, a village some 8 miles from Rugeley. The bride was radiant. The groom stood straight at the altar, his surgeon's hands folded before him. The house on Market Street was ready. Good furniture, decent curtains, a servant or two. Downstairs, the consulting rooms. Upstairs, the bedrooms where Anne would build her household. Across the street, the Talbot Arms, a coaching inn of no particular distinction. In a few years' time, a man would die in one of its rooms, directly visible from the Palmer's bedroom window. But for now, in the autumn of 1847, it was simply a neighbour. In 1848, their first child was born, William Brooks Palmer, named after both his father and his maternal grandfather. He was a healthy boy. He would be the only one of their children to survive infancy. The early months passed in domestic tranquility. The doctor attended his patients. Anne managed the house. The baby thrived. Neighbours called. The Palmers were invited to dinners and returned the courtesy. Behind this pleasant surface, however, the mathematics of ruin were already at work. Palmer had discovered the racecourse, not as a pastime, but as a consuming passion that gripped him with the force of an addiction. The stakes grew, the losses mounted, and the hands that healed by day signed promissory notes by night, pledging money he did not have on horses that did not win. Then, in January of 1849, Anne's mother came to stay. Mary Ann Thornton arrived at Market Street in the first week of the new year. She was a woman of comfortable means, the widow of the late Colonel Brooks, whose suicide 15 years earlier had left her with a decent inheritance. She came bearing money. Whether she had lent it to her son-in-law or merely intended to, the sources do not quite agree. For roughly a fortnight, the household continued normally. The elder Mrs. Thornton dined with her daughter and son-in-law. She played with her grandson. She sat by the fire whilst the doctor attended his patients downstairs. On the 18th of January 1849, she was taken suddenly and violently ill. Within hours, she was dead. The coroner's verdict was apoplexy. Palmer, the attending physician, signed the death certificate himself. No questions were asked. He received approximately £8,000, a portion of his mother-in-law's estate. £8,000, a fortune by any ordinary measure, enough to clear every debt, to build a future of security. Palmer spent it in 18 months. The horses at Chester and Doncaster consumed it as a furnace consumes coal, steadily, greedily, without remorse. Because the horses at Chester had their own opinions about who ought to win. To understand what drove William Palmer towards the gallows, one must first understand the world of the Victorian racecourse, for it was this world, more than any defect of character, that provided the engine of his destruction. The English races of the 1850s were carnivals of money and madness. Picture it, the thunder of hooves on packed earth, the howl of the crowd surging to its feet, the frantic bellowing of bookmakers adjusting their odds, the clink of sovereigns passing from hand to hand, the pop of champagne corks, the shriek of a woman who has won, the groan of a man who has lost. And through it all, the smell, horse sweat, cigar smoke, spilled ale, trampled grass, perfume, manure, a thick, intoxicating fog hanging over the course like incense in a cathedral of greed. Palmer did not merely attend the races. He threw himself into them with the abandon of a man leaping from a bridge. He bought horses. He hired trainers. He maintained a racing stable that cost between £500 and £1,000 a year before a single wager was placed. A country surgeon earned perhaps £400 annually. Palmer was spending 5 times that on the turf alone. The gap between what he earned and what he owed grew wider with each season, and into that gap poured borrowed money, first in a trickle, then in a torrent. The moneylenders of London knew him well. Thomas Pratt, Padwick. Others whose names have faded, but whose ledgers told the same story. William Palmer of Rugeley, borrowing at rates of 40, 50, 60% per annum, signing promissory notes with a flourish. When his own credit ran dry, he turned to forgery, forging his mother's signature on bills of exchange, pledging her assets as security for loans she had never authorized. The deception was carried out with brazen. One scene captures the arrangement perfectly. A cramped London office, the moneylender behind his desk, the doctor in his good coat and polished boots. "Mr. Palmer," Pratt said, peering at the signature through his spectacles, "your mother's hand seems rather different this time." "Rheumatism. Her fingers tremble." "Of course, rheumatism." A pause. Both men knew the truth. Neither spoke it. The money changed hands. The interest began to accrue. And somewhere in Rugeley, Mary Palmer went about her business, unaware that her name was being pledged against debts that would eventually amount to more than £12,000. It was during these years of accelerating ruin that another man came to stay in the Palmer household and did not leave alive. Leonard Bladen was an acquaintance from the racing world, a minor figure in the ecosystem of bookmakers and gentlemen gamblers. He visited Palmer in Rugeley sometime in 1850. The nature of their financial entanglement is unclear. Some sources state Palmer owed Bladen £600. Others suggest the debt ran the other way. What is not disputed is that Bladen fell ill during his stay, that he died in the Palmer house, and that his death was attributed to the complications of an old hip injury. Nor is it disputed that after Bladen's death, his betting books vanished. His widow wrote to Palmer demanding the return of her husband's possessions. The reply, if one was sent, has not survived. The episode was never investigated. No inquest was convened. Bladen was buried, and his financial relationship with the doctor was extinguished along with him. A pattern was forming, not yet visible, not yet named, but there, like a figure emerging from fog. People who came to Palmer's house with money or with claims upon his money had a tendency to leave it in a coffin. And through these same years, a quieter tragedy unfolded, not on the racecourse or in the moneylender's office, but in the upstairs rooms of the house on Market Street, where Anne Palmer bore child after child and buried them, one by one, in the churchyard at Rugeley. Their first son, William Brooks, born in 1848, survived. But between 1849 and 1854, Anne gave birth to 4 more children, and all 4 died in infancy. The recorded cause in each case was the same: convulsions. 150 out of every 1,000 infants died before their first birthday in the England of the 1850s. 4 deaths in a single family, whilst devastating, was not statistically remarkable. The churchyards of Staffordshire were crowded with tiny graves. After Palmer's conviction in 1856, whispered questions circulated. Had the children died naturally, or had their father hastened their departure? The suspicion was never substantiated. No bodies were exhumed. No insurance policies on the children were discovered. No evidence of any kind was produced. It remains a rumor, nothing more. The silence of the evidence is itself a kind of testimony. We simply do not know. What we can say is what these deaths did to Anne. Not the facts of her grief, those are lost, but the shape of it. After the first child died, she wept. After the second, a deeper silence. After the third, something harder, a stillness that might have been resignation or might have been something else entirely. It was after the third death, or perhaps the fourth, that she turned to her husband one evening and asked the question that must have been forming for months. "William, why do they all die?" A pause. The doctor looked at his wife. "It is God's will, Anne. These are our trials." She looked at him. What she saw in his face, grief, indifference, or something from which she quickly turned away, cannot be known. She said nothing more. And in that silence, the house on Market Street grew a little colder, a little emptier, a little more like a mausoleum than a home. Meanwhile, Palmer had discovered a new instrument of finance, one that combined his medical expertise with his desperation in a manner that was grimly ingenious. He had discovered life insurance. The industry in mid-Victorian England was booming. Companies proliferated. Agents canvassed aggressively. Medical examinations were cursory. A few questions, a brief inspection, and the signature of a qualified physician. The system was built upon trust, and trust was William Palmer's most polished tool. He insured Anne for £13,000, more than 30 times his annual income. The premium alone was £750 a year. Why would a provincial surgeon insure his young wife for such a wildly disproportionate sum? The insurance company did not ask. He turned next to his brother Walter, an amiable drunkard whose principal achievement was the steady destruction of his own liver. Palmer attempted to insure Walter's life for £82,000. The companies balked. He tried again, 14,000, with the Prince of Wales Insurance Company. The policy was accepted. Palmer ensured Walter had access to unlimited gin, visiting regularly, always with a bottle, always pressing another glass, always with that smile. When he attempted to insure a farm labourer named George Bate for £10,000, naming himself as beneficiary, even the most accommodating underwriters refused. The refusal should have served as a warning. It did not. There were other complications in the household of a more intimate nature, but these would not become public knowledge until after Palmer's arrest. For now, the house on Market Street kept its secrets, and the doctor continued to see his patients, to attend the races, to walk across the street to the Talbot Arms and back, as though nothing in the world were amiss. By the autumn of 1854, the position was catastrophic. Palmer owed between £10,000 and £12,500. His income was a fraction of what he needed. His horses continued to lose. The moneylenders were growing impatient. The forged bills, if discovered, meant prosecution, and his wife was insured for £13,000. The cholera that year killed 23,000 people across Great Britain. One of those deaths proved exceptionally convenient. Anne Palmer fell ill in the last week of September 1854. The symptoms were consistent with what the Victorians called English cholera, a form of acute gastroenteritis. Violent vomiting, uncontrollable diarrhea, cramping pains. It was a death that thousands suffered that year in towns and villages across the country. William Palmer nursed his wife. He sat at her bedside. He administered medicines. He did everything a devoted husband and competent physician might be expected to do. In those final weeks, Anne was seen less and less in the streets of Rugeley. A neighbour who called upon her in mid-September found her pale, listless, oddly resigned. "Anne, my dear, you look so pale. Has Dr. Palmer examined you?" Anne managed a thin smile. "My husband says I need rest and fresh air." "And that is all. That is all." What lay behind those three words, obedience, exhaustion, or a knowledge she dared not voice, only Anne could have said. She never did. On the 29th of September 1854, Anne Palmer died. She was 27 years old. The death certificate recorded cholera as the cause. Palmer signed it himself. 2 years later, after Palmer's arrest, Anne's body was exhumed. In the tissues of her organs, analysts found traces of antimony, a metallic element that produces symptoms remarkably similar to cholera: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, collapse. Antimony was also a widely used medicine. Palmer could have administered it legitimately, or with a different purpose entirely. No charge was ever brought. The antimony was suggestive, but not conclusive. Anne's death remains officially unresolved, a question mark that no one has been able to straighten into an exclamation point. But consider the facts, stripped of sentiment. A woman insured for £13,000, a husband drowning in debts, a household already shadowed by unexplained deaths, a cholera epidemic that provided a ready-made explanation for any sudden illness, and a doctor who possessed both the knowledge and the means to administer a lethal substance under the guise of treatment. Consider, too, the woman herself, not as an insurance figure, but as a living person in her final hours. Anne Palmer, lying in the upstairs bedroom, her body racked by spasms she could not control. Somewhere in the house, her surviving son, 6 years old, too young to understand, old enough to be frightened, and her husband at her bedside, holding out a spoonful of medicine. She took it. She had always taken the medicine. She was a Victorian wife, and Victorian wives did as their husbands told them, especially when those husbands were doctors. The architecture of an entire civilization pressed down upon a single woman in a single bed, leaving her no room to refuse, no language in which to frame her refusal. Anne Palmer died on a Sunday evening. By Monday morning, her husband was writing to the insurance company. £13,000. It arrived in due course and was absorbed into the bottomless appetite of Palmer's debts, as a river is absorbed into the sea. Within 4 months, every penny was gone. The winter of 1854 gave way to spring, and now the secrets of the house on Market Street began to show. Eliza Tharm, a young domestic servant in the Palmer household, was carrying the doctor's child. The affair had begun whilst Anne was alive, perhaps in the very weeks of her final illness. On the 26th or 27th of June 1855, Eliza gave birth to a boy christened Alfred. His father's name does not appear in the parish register, but the identity of the father was an open secret in Rugeley. The arithmetic is disquieting. If Alfred was conceived in late September or early October 1854, Palmer was sleeping with the maid at the very time his wife lay dying. Consolation sought in grief. Or a replacement already in position before the vacancy had arisen. Palmer now found himself a widower with a young son, a newborn he could not publicly acknowledge, and not a penny to his name. The clocks were ticking. 3 events would converge upon his life in the months that followed, each propelling him closer to catastrophe. The first was a death. Walter Palmer, the brother, the amiable drunkard, the man insured for £14,000, died on the 16th of August, 1855. The official cause was general debility compounded by alcoholism. The Prince of Wales Insurance Company, alert to the suspicious frequency with which people connected to the doctor seemed to die, refused to pay. Palmer received the refusal at his home. One sees those surgeons' hands, the same hands that had rolled pills and signed death certificates, holding the letter. For the first time, perhaps, they trembled, not from guilt, from arithmetic. Without that 14,000, the numbers did not work. The forged bills would be presented. His mother would deny them. Forgery was a felony. "Bad news, sir?" the servant asked. Palmer folded the letter into his pocket. His voice was level. "No, just a misunderstanding." But it was not a misunderstanding. Without money, and quickly, the entire structure of deception would collapse. The second event was a horse race. The Shrewsbury Autumn Meeting of 1855 took place over 3 days in mid-November. Among the crowd were 2 men who knew each other well, William Palmer and John Parsons Cook. Cook was 28, a former solicitor who had abandoned the law for horse racing. He owned a mare called Polestar and had a gambler's faith in his own luck. He was young, unattached, and flush. He and Palmer had been friends for some time, thrown together by their shared passion for the turf. On the 13th of November, Polestar won her race. Cook's winnings amounted to between £2,000 and £3,000. Palmer, who had backed other horses, lost. That evening, in a public house in Shrewsbury, the 2 men drank together. Cook ordered brandy, took a sip, and recoiled. "Good God, what is this? My throat's on fire." Palmer leaned forward, all concern. "Probably off. Bad barrel. Here, have some water." Was this the first attempt? The brandy that burned Cook's throat has been debated for a century and a half. Some historians believe Palmer introduced something into the glass. Others think it was simply rough spirits. The truth is lost in conflicting testimony. Cook fell ill, not gravely, but persistently. Palmer, ever attentive, offered to accompany his friend back to Rugeley, where Cook could recuperate under the doctor's personal care. Cook agreed. It was the most consequential decision of his short life. They returned to Rugeley together. Palmer went home to Market Street. Cook checked into the Talbot Arms, the coaching inn directly opposite. He took a room on the first floor, and William Palmer, the most agreeable man in Rugeley, began the final act of his career. For 5 days after their return, Cook languished at the inn, feverish, nauseous, unable to keep food down, but not yet desperate enough to seek help beyond his friend the doctor. Palmer visited daily, bringing broth and reassurance. The performance of devotion was impeccable. Then, on Monday, the 19th of November, the devoted friend went shopping for strychnine. His first call that Monday morning was at the surgery of Dr. Benjamin Salt, where he purchased a quantity of Batley's solution, a proprietary preparation whose principal ingredient was opium. His second call was more significant. He walked to the shop of Hawkins the chemist, where he was served by an assistant named Charles Newton. From Newton, he purchased 3 grains of strychnine. 3 grains, a quantity so small it could sit on the tip of a finger, a quantity so lethal it could kill a horse. Palmer signed no register. He had learnt the properties of strychnine at St. Bartholomew's and had dispensed it in his own practice, selling it, on occasion, without keeping written records. He did not need to revisit the textbooks. He knew the dose. Newton measured it out without question. He placed the small paper packet in his pocket. He walked back to Market Street. He prepared his pills. Tuesday, the 20th of November. During the day, Cook's condition fluctuated. He was well enough to sit up, to take a little broth, to complain about his confinement. Palmer visited several times, solicitous, cheerful, encouraging. In the late afternoon, he brought a bowl of soup, which the patient consumed without incident. Then, in the evening, he brought the pills. The scene, as described by Elizabeth Mills, the chambermaid at the Talbot Arms, who would become the prosecution's most critical witness, was unremarkable in its domesticity. The doctor arrived, carrying a small box. Cook was in bed, propped against pillows, pale but conscious. Palmer sat down beside him, produced 2 pills, small, white, innocuous, and held them out. Cook took them. He swallowed them with a draught of water. Palmer watched. At approximately midnight, the silence of the Talbot Arms was shattered by a scream. Elizabeth Mills, sleeping in a nearby room, was startled awake by a sound she would later describe to the court in words that lost nothing for their simplicity, a cry of the most dreadful agony she had ever heard. She threw on her shawl and ran. The young man was in the grip of a convulsion so violent it seemed to lift his body from the mattress. His back was arched, not in the ordinary way of a man stretching, but bent into an impossible curve, the back of his head nearly touching his heels. Every muscle appeared to be contracting at once, pulling his limbs rigid, clenching his jaw, stretching his face into a grimace of unspeakable terror. His eyes were open. His skin was drenched in sweat. The bed frame shook. Palmer was already there. He stood beside the bed with the composed air of a man confronting an emergency he had seen before. He placed his hand on Cook's wrist. He spoke soothingly. He turned to the horrified chambermaid. "Nothing to worry about, Elizabeth. An ordinary fit. Fetch some hot water, would you?" Ordinary. That was the word he used. Mills did as she was told, because he was the doctor, because he spoke with authority, because what else could a chambermaid do in the face of medical expertise but obey? Gradually, over the course of an hour, the convulsions subsided. By dawn, Cook was exhausted but alive, lying limp and grey-faced amongst the tangled sheets. He had survived the first attempt. He would not survive the second. Wednesday, the 21st of November. The day passed quietly. Cook was weak but conscious. He managed some toast, a cup of tea. Palmer came and went, checking his pulse, adjusting his pillows. In the afternoon, the 2 men spoke about Polestar's winnings and the settlement of accounts with the bookmakers. Palmer, who had been quietly intercepting Cook's financial correspondence and attempting to gain access to his winnings, was reassuring. Everything was in hand. Cook should rest. Evening came. The candles were lit. November darkness pressed against the windows. Palmer crossed the street once more. He brought more pills. Cook was reluctant. He had not forgotten the previous night. But Palmer was persuasive, gentle, insistent, medically authoritative. A new preparation, he may have said. Something to ensure a peaceful night. Cook, too weak to argue, too accustomed to deferring to his friend's judgment, took them from the doctor's outstretched hand and swallowed. The effect was catastrophic. At roughly midnight, some sources say a little before, others a little after, Cook was seized by a second wave of convulsions that dwarfed the first. His body locked into the terrible arch of opisthotonus. His spine bowed so severely that only his head and heels touched the mattress. His fists were clenched. His teeth ground with a sound that the chambermaid said she could hear through the wall. Every voluntary muscle was in simultaneous maximum contraction, a full-body cramp of such ferocity that the skeleton itself seemed ready to crack. He screamed. Then he could not scream because the muscles of his throat had seized. His breathing became shallow, then labored, then absent. The convulsions came in waves, a spasm, a brief shuddering relaxation, then another worse than the last. Each cycle drained a little more life. Each interval grew shorter. Each contraction grew stronger. Palmer stood at the bedside. He felt for a pulse. He shook his head. John Parsons Cook died in the small hours of the 21st of November, 1855. He was 28 years old. He had won £3,000 at the Shrewsbury races 8 days earlier. He had come to Rugeley to celebrate his fortune in the company of a friend. He left it in a box. The silence that followed was profound. Mills stood trembling in the doorway. Palmer straightened up, composed his features into an expression of professional sorrow, and announced that his patient had died of natural causes, most likely a severe epileptic seizure. Nobody challenged him. He was the doctor. The machinery of Victorian deference ground forward, as it had after the deaths of Anne, and of the mother-in-law, and of Blaydon, and of the 4 small children. The doctor had spoken. The matter was settled, except that this time it was not. In the hours that followed, Palmer moved with the frantic energy of a man who knows the ground beneath him is cracking. His actions, meticulously documented in the trial testimony, paint a portrait not of a mastermind, but of a desperate improviser, plugging leaks in a dam about to burst. He volunteered to arrange the post-mortem examination, giving himself control of the evidence. He selected the doctors, local men who knew him and deferred to him. He was present throughout, hovering at the shoulders of the operating physicians. Then, at a crucial moment, he stumbled against an assistant carrying a jar containing Cook's stomach and its contents, the single most important piece of evidence in any poisoning case. The jar tilted. A portion of its contents splashed onto the floor. An accident. Palmer said so. At the trial, the prosecution argued it was deliberate. The defense countered that the room was crowded and the floor slippery. The jar, diminished but not empty, was sealed and sent to London. Palmer pursued other avenues. He attempted to intercept the postboy carrying the sample, offering money to tamper with the package. The attempt failed. He wrote a letter to the coroner, enclosing a £10 banknote and expressing the hope that the inquest would reach a verdict of natural causes. "My dear sir," the letter read, "I enclose a small token of my esteem and trust that the examination will confirm death from natural causes." £10, the price Palmer placed upon a coroner's integrity. The coroner, to his credit, preserved the letter. In due course it was produced in open court. The decisive intervention came from John Parsons, Cook's stepfather. William Henry Stevens arrived in Rugeley within days. He was a man of means, of suspicion, and of determination. He did not trust Palmer. He demanded a full and independent investigation. Stevens got what he demanded. The case was referred to London, to Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor at Guy's Hospital, the foremost toxicologist in England. Taylor performed his analysis with the crude but methodical tools of his era: color reactions, precipitation tests, extracts from the victim's tissues administered to laboratory animals. The instruments were blunt. A gas chromatograph would not exist for another century. Taylor could not find strychnine in Cook's remains. The substance is metabolized rapidly. The methods of 1855 were easily defeated by small doses and the passage of time. But what Taylor did find were the symptoms. Every witness described the same clinical picture: sudden violent convulsions, opisthotonus, lockjaw, full consciousness, maintained throughout, death by asphyxiation as the respiratory muscles succumbed. No other condition known to medicine produced this precise constellation of signs. Tetanus came closest, but tetanus develops gradually, over days, not in a sudden paroxysm triggered by the ingestion of pills. Taylor's conclusion was unequivocal. Cook had died of strychnine poisoning. The absence of chemical detection did not alter the medical certainty. It was a revolutionary claim. For the first time in English legal history, a man would be accused of murder by poisoning on the basis of clinical observation alone, without the corroboration of a chemical test. Palmer was arrested on the 15th of December 1855. The constables came to Market Street in the grey light of a winter morning. They knocked. The door opened. "Gentlemen," Palmer said, with the composure that had served him all his life, "I am at your service." He smiled. For the last time in his own house, the most agreeable man in Rugeley smiled at the people who had come to take him away. The arrest detonated across England like a bomb in a library. Within days, his name was on every front page. The Illustrated London News devoted pages to the case. Penny broadsheets offered lurid accounts of the Rugeley Poisoner. People travelled to the town simply to see the places where the crimes had occurred, standing outside the house on Market Street, taking refreshment at the Talbot Arms, asking to be shown the room where Cook died. The legal problem was precisely this notoriety. By the time the case was ready for trial, scarcely a man or woman in Staffordshire had not formed an opinion. To impanel an impartial jury in the county was a practical impossibility. What happened next was without precedent. Palmer's defence petitioned Parliament for a transfer to London. The House of Commons argued for 3 days. The result was an Act of Parliament, the Trial of Offences Act of 1856, known as the Palmer Act. It authorised the transfer of criminal cases between jurisdictions when local prejudice made a fair hearing impossible. The first and only time a specific statute was enacted for a single defendant. The irony was exquisite. A law bearing a suspected murderer's name would, for decades, safeguard the rights of the accused. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 14th of May 1856. It would last 12 days. The courtroom was packed to capacity every morning before the doors opened. Barristers, journalists, society ladies, members of Parliament, and clergymen jostled for seats with the determination of racegoers angling for a view of the finishing post. 3 men dominated the proceedings. The judge, John Campbell, Baron Campbell, Lord Chief Justice of England, a formidable Scotsman of 77 whose long face and longer experience lent him sepulchral authority. Campbell was not, by temperament, a neutral arbiter. His interventions would later be criticised as partial to the prosecution. The prosecutor, Sir Alexander Cockburn, the Attorney General. His opening address lasted an entire day, laying out the whole grim tapestry. The debts, the insurance, the purchased strychnine, the screams in the night, the sabotaged post-mortem, the bribe. He did not call the defendant a monster. He did not need to. The defender, Sergeant William Shee, an Irishman of ability but limited oratorical flair, who faced the unenviable task of representing a client whom the country had already condemned. The trial turned on 3 pivotal moments. The first was the testimony of Elizabeth Mills. The chambermaid took the witness stand with the nervous self-consciousness of a working woman thrust into the glare of the century's most sensational trial. She was not eloquent. She did not need to be. In plain language, the language of a woman who scrubbed floors and carried trays, she described what she had seen on the nights of the 20th and 21st of November. The screams, the convulsions, the rigid arch of Cook's body. Palmer's calm. The pills. Several women in the gallery wept. Mills's testimony was devastating not because it was dramatic, but because it was artless. The second was the confrontation between the defense and Dr. Taylor. The toxicologist was precise, composed, and unapologetic. Sergeant Shee rose. Dr. Taylor, you conducted a thorough chemical analysis of the deceased's remains. I did. And did you discover the presence of strychnine? I did not. You did not. And yet you tell this court that the deceased was killed by strychnine. I do. The clinical evidence admits no other conclusion. You are asking this jury to convict on the basis of a poison you cannot prove was ever present in the body. I am asking this jury to consider the totality of the evidence, the symptoms described by multiple witnesses, the known properties of strychnine, its purchase by the defendant, the administration of pills immediately preceding the convulsions, and the absence of any alternative explanation. The failure to detect strychnine chemically is consistent with its known behavior. It is metabolized rapidly. Its absence from the assay does not mean it was absent from the victim. The exchange was more than a legal skirmish. It was a watershed in forensic science. The moment expert testimony stepped forward to occupy the ground that physical evidence could not reach. The third was the briefest. When asked to enter his plea, Palmer spoke 2 words: not guilty. His voice was level. His gaze steady. He did not elaborate. On the 27th of May 1856, after 12 days of testimony, the jury retired. They returned in approximately 1 hour and 17 minutes. The foreman delivered the verdict in a single word: guilty. The courtroom erupted. Palmer, standing in the dock, went pale but did not stagger, did not weep, did not cry out. He gripped the rail and spoke, in a voice audible to those nearest him, a sentence that would be debated for generations. I am innocent of poisoning Cook by strychnine. 8 words. Note what they contain and what they omit. He did not say, I am innocent. He said he was innocent of poisoning Cook by strychnine asterisk. Was it hair-splitting, the reflex of a man grasping at technicalities, a genuine protest, or a veiled admission that Cook had been poisoned by a different agent? Scholars have argued all three. The question remains suspended in the amber of history. Lord Campbell donned the black cap and pronounced the sentence of death. Palmer was to be taken to Stafford jail and there hanged by the neck until dead. The date was set, the 14th of June, 1856. He had 18 days to live. The condemned man spent those 18 days in a manner that astonished everyone who observed him. He ate 3 meals a day with appetite and apparent enjoyment. He slept soundly. The prison chaplain, who visited daily, later reported that Palmer slept like a baby, a choice of simile that, given the number of babies who had died in the Palmer household, carried an unintended chill. He received visitors, including his mother, whose conversations with her son were private and have not survived. He read, he prayed or appeared to. He displayed none of the anguish, the remorse, the terror that one might expect of a man counting down his final hours. Was it courage? Was it the numbness of a man incapable of feeling what others feel? Was it the serenity of genuine innocence, or of guilt so thoroughly walled off that it could no longer reach him? The chaplain did not know. The warders did not know. Palmer kept his own counsel to the end, maintaining his composure, giving nothing away. The 14th of June, 1856 dawned over Stafford, a midsummer morning, the sky overcast with the soft, diffuse cloud that is the default setting of the English Midlands. By 6 o'clock, the streets around the prison were already impassable. 30,000 people had come to watch William Palmer die. They had come from Birmingham, from Wolverhampton, from Liverpool, from London. The railway companies, with the entrepreneurial instinct of the age, had laid on special excursion trains departing in the early hours so that passengers might arrive in time. Victorian England had come to Stafford for a show, and it intended to get its money's worth. The scene outside the prison gates resembled a fairground. Hawkers sold pies, ale, ginger beer, and printed broadsheets carrying the condemned man's portrait. Pickpockets worked the crowd. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Windows in the houses overlooking the prison yard had been rented at £1 apiece, a week's wages for a labouring man, and everyone was occupied. The noise was a sustained roar of 30,000 voices, punctuated by laughter, shouts of recognition, and the cries of vendors. This was not justice. This was spectacle, the same impulse that filled the Roman amphitheatre and the Parisian guillotine square. The ancient, ineradicable human appetite for watching death administered to someone who is not oneself. The Victorians differed from their ancestors only in the refinement of their clothing and the sophistication of their excuses. At 8 o'clock, the prison doors opened and William Palmer was led out. The executioner was William Calcraft, a man who had held the office of public hangman since 1829. Calcraft was 60 years old, experienced and methodical, but possessed of a professional limitation. He favoured the short drop. Unlike the long drop method introduced later in the century, designed to break the neck instantaneously, Calcraft's technique allowed the condemned to fall only a short distance. Death came not from a broken neck but from slow strangulation, a process that could take several minutes. Palmer walked to the scaffold with a steady step. The chaplain walked beside him, murmuring prayers. The crowd fell to a hush. He mounted the steps. He stood upon the trap door. He looked down at the mechanism beneath his feet, the hinged boards, the bolt, the lever that would send him into empty air. According to numerous contemporary accounts and later biographies, though some historians consider the remark too polished to be genuine, he spoke. "Are you sure it's safe?" 4 words. Was it bravado? Was it the unbreakable habit of a man who had charmed his way through every crisis? Or was it genuine, the involuntary reflex of a mind that could not stop calculating risk, even on the threshold of oblivion? The question, like the man who posed it, resists a simple answer. Calcraft fitted the white hood. He tightened the noose. The bolt was drawn. The trapdoor fell open. William Palmer dropped. By the accounts of those who stood closest, the death was not instantaneous. The body jerked. The rope swung. For several agonizing minutes, the figure at the end of the rope convulsed with a ghastly echo of the spasms that had killed John Parsons' cook. Then stillness. His hands hung behind his back, bound with a leather strap. Those same hands. The hands that had healed and harmed, that had rolled pills and forged signatures, that had cradled infants and counted banknotes, that had closed the eyes of the dead and opened the veins of the living. They were motionless now. The crowd exhaled a great collective release of breath, part satisfaction, part relief, part something darker. Then the noise returned. The murmur, the chatter, the resumption of ordinary life. The pie sellers did a brisk final trade. The special trains began boarding. By noon, Stafford was quiet again. Palmer's body was taken down and buried within the walls of Stafford jail. It was not returned to his family. Some sources suggest the remains were made available for medical study. A final, grim irony. The surgeon's body surrendered to the profession he had betrayed, laid open on the same kind of table where he had once learnt the arts that enabled him to kill. The hangman's rope was cut into short lengths and sold at 5 shillings per inch. Within the week, a wax effigy of William Palmer had been installed in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussaud's, where it would remain for decades. One more still, smiling face in a gallery of the infamous, gazing out at the paying public with an expression of permanent, inscrutable pleasantness. And in Rugeley, in the house on Market Street, a woman who had borne 7 children and buried one on the gallows spoke the words that would outlast all the verdicts, all the arguments, all the solemn pronouncements of judges. "They have hanged my saintly Billy." Whether Mary Palmer said this on the day of the execution or in the days that followed, the sources do not agree. But she said it. And in those 6 words, she compressed the entirety of a mother's love, a mother's blindness, and a mother's unbreakable refusal to see her child as the world saw him. Was it delusion, faith, defiance, the willful self-deception of a woman who could not survive the truth, or did she know everything and love him still? We honor the question by not answering it. Palmer was dead. But the story does not end with the drop of a trapdoor, because after him came the living, the people left behind in the wreckage of his life, condemned to carry a name that had become the most notorious in England. Consider the boy first. William Brooks Palmer was 8 years old when his father was hanged. His mother had died 2 years before. 4 of his siblings lay in the churchyard. He was, in every meaningful sense, alone, the sole surviving product of a household that the newspapers had branded a charnel house. Whatever became of him was shaped by a single, inescapable fact. He was the son of the Rugeley Poisoner. What we know of his later life is sparse. He lived to the age of 78, dying in 1926. He lived quietly. He avoided public attention. Whether he changed his surname, as many children of notorious criminals did, the records are contradictory. Who raised him after the execution is uncertain. His grandmother Mary, most likely the same woman who called her hanged son Saintly Billy. What conversations passed between the old woman and the growing boy, what questions he asked, and what answers she gave, history has not preserved. But consider this. In 1914, when the Great War began, William Brooks Palmer was 66 years old enough to remember everything, old enough to have watched, year after year, as the newspapers dragged out his father's name whenever a new poisoning case made the headlines. Every arsenic scandal, every suspicious death, every sensational trial brought the same inevitable comparison. Not since Palmer. He carried that inheritance for nearly 7 decades. The weight of it is beyond reckoning. Now consider the shadow. Eliza Tharm and her son Alfred disappear from the historical record almost entirely after Palmer's execution. We do not know where Eliza went. We do not know what became of the boy. In Victorian England, an illegitimate child fathered by a hanged murderer was worse than invisible. He was unspeakable, a living embarrassment to be hidden, renamed, absorbed into the anonymous mass of the working poor. The silence of the archives is itself a verdict. Eliza and Alfred were erased, not from life, but from history. Parish registers do not mourn. Census returns do not grieve. They simply omit. Finally, consider the town. Rugeley had never asked to be famous. It was a market town of no particular ambition, content with its cattle sales and its coaching trade and its quiet rhythms of provincial life. Palmer's crimes made it the most talked-about settlement in England, and the talk was uniformly dreadful. The name Rugeley became synonymous with poison. Visitors came not to admire the church or walk by the river, but to gawp at the house of a murderer. The townspeople were mortified. A petition was drawn up requesting permission to change the town's name, to shed the association, to begin again with a fresh identity unburdened by infamy. The petition was sent, according to the most widely repeated version of the story, to the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston. His lordship's reply, if the anecdote is to be believed, and some historians doubt it, was characteristically dry. By all means rename your town. You may call it Palmerston if you wish. Whether the exchange actually occurred in these terms is uncertain. What is certain is that the town was not renamed. Rugeley remains Rugeley to this day. The Talbot Arms was rechristened. Some accounts say it became the Shrewsbury Arms, but the building still stands, opposite the house on Market Street, with the same 30 metres of cobblestone between them. If you were to visit today, you would see a quiet English street, an old house, an old inn. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to suggest that in the winter of 1855, a man crossed that short distance carrying pills in his pocket and murder in his heart. At least, so far as we know. The legacy that William Palmer left behind was not measured in property or progeny. He left no estate. Every penny had been consumed by the racecourse and the moneylenders. He left no memoir, no confession, no explanatory letter. What he left, instead, were consequences, ripples that spread outward from his crimes through the law, through science, through the culture of an entire nation, and that have not entirely subsided even now, more than a century and a half later. The first consequence was scientific. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor's testimony at the trial had established a principle that would reshape forensic medicine for generations. A man had been convicted of poisoning on the basis of clinical symptoms alone, without chemical proof that the poison was present in the body. The implications were profound and troubling in equal measure. If expert opinion could substitute for physical evidence, then the power of the medical witness became virtually unlimited, and the protections available to the accused were correspondingly diminished. The debate did not end with Palmer's conviction. It intensified. Taylor's methods and conclusions were scrutinized, challenged, and defended in medical journals, in courtrooms, in the lecture halls of the great teaching hospitals. Some toxicologists supported his reasoning unreservedly. Others argued that clinical observation, however expert, was inherently fallible, that symptoms could be misinterpreted, that rare conditions could mimic poisoning, that the absence of chemical proof should have raised a reasonable doubt. Modern scholarship has added a further complication. Some researchers, notably the historian Ian Burney and the chemist John M. Sly, have suggested that Cook may have died not of strychnine but of tetanus, a disease whose symptoms bear a striking resemblance to those of strychnine poisoning: violent convulsions, opisthotonous respiratory failure. The distinction in 1855 was virtually impossible to draw with certainty. We note the possibility without rendering a verdict. The question remains open, as perhaps it should. There is one more forensic detail worth recording. In 1946, 90 years after the trial, a document was discovered among the personal effects of a Staffordshire collector. It was a bill, or the reverse of a bill, bearing what appeared to be William Palmer's handwriting and recording the purchase of opium and strychnine. The document had not been available at the trial. It had surfaced too late to influence the verdict and too early to benefit from modern methods of authentication. It is one more piece in a mosaic that, however many fragments are added, never quite resolves into a complete picture. The second consequence was legal. The Palmer Act, the Trial of Offences Act of 1856, remained on the statute books for decades. It established the principle that a defendant's right to a fair trial could, in exceptional circumstances, override the ancient tradition of local jurisdiction. The law was invoked in subsequent cases, though rarely. Its significance lay less in its practical application than in its symbolic weight. The recognition, enshrined in legislation, that justice must not merely be done, but must be seen to be done, and that seeing, in a community poisoned by prejudice, could sometimes require a change of scenery. The third consequence was cultural. Palmer entered the national imagination as a figure of peculiar fascination, not because his crimes were the most numerous, they were not, or the most gruesome, far from it, but because of the appalling contrast between what he appeared to be and what he was: a doctor, a healer, a man of science and compassion, pledged to preserve life, who had used his knowledge to end it. The betrayal was not merely personal, it was professional, institutional, existential. If you could not trust your doctor, whom could you trust? Robert Graves, the poet and novelist, not the physician, published a fictionalized account of the case in 1957 under the title, "They Hanged My Saintly Billy." Graves, characteristically, took a contrarian view, suggesting that Palmer may have been partially innocent, a victim of circumstantial evidence and public hysteria. The novel is not a reliable guide to the facts, but it captures something essential about the case: its irreducible ambiguity, its refusal to yield a neat moral. Charles Dickens, who followed the trial closely, is said to have described Palmer as the greatest villain who ever stood in the Old Bailey. The attribution is widely repeated, but imperfectly documented. Whether Dickens said it in precisely those words, or in words that were later improved by retelling, the sentiment was shared by much of the nation. Palmer was convicted of one murder, that of John Parsons Cook. He is suspected of many more, 3 at the low end of the estimates, 14 at the high. The most sober assessment of the evidence suggests that Cook was almost certainly murdered, that Anne Palmer was very probably poisoned with antimony, that the mother-in-law's death is deeply suspicious, that Walter Palmer's demise was, at the very least, convenient, and that Leonard Bladen's visit to the house on Market Street ended in circumstances that do not bear innocent explanation. The deaths of the 4 infants remain the most troubling and the least answerable of all the questions that surround this case. 3, 5, 14. The honest answer is that we do not know, and we are unlikely ever to know with certainty. There is a threshold beyond which counting ceases to matter, not to the law, which must be precise, but to the conscience. If Palmer killed even once, the moral calculus is complete. If he killed more than once, the additional entries alter the magnitude of the crime, but not its nature. Murder is murder. The soul, if he had one, and every human being does, however deeply buried, crosses the line only once. After that, there is only repetition. There is a question that the Palmer case poses with uncomfortable directness, a question that the Victorians preferred not to examine too closely, and that we, in our own age of institutional trust and professional regulation, might do well to consider. How did he get away with it for so long? The answer is not complicated. It is, in fact, dismayingly simple. He got away with it because he was a doctor. In the England of the 1850s, the medical profession occupied a position of almost unassailable authority. A doctor's word was not merely an opinion. It was a pronouncement, backed by education, by social standing, by the implicit trust of a society that had no alternative framework for understanding illness and death. When a patient died, the attending physician certified the cause. When a family grieved, the doctor offered his explanation. When a coroner inquired, the medical man gave his testimony. At every stage of the process, from sickbed to coffin to grave, the doctor stood as gatekeeper, interpreter, and final authority. There was no second opinion. There was no routine toxicological screening. There was no suspicious death protocol of the kind that modern police forces take for granted. Palmer exploited this system not through cunning but through competence. He was not a bad doctor. By all accounts, he was a rather good one, attentive, knowledgeable, reassuring. His patients trusted him because he deserved their trust, at least in the narrow, technical sense that he understood their ailments and treated them effectively. The horror of his case lies not in the fact that he was a charlatan. He was not, but in the fact that genuine skill and genuine evil coexisted in the same pair of hands, and that the skill made the evil invisible. The system has changed since then. Death certification is now subject to oversight. Coroners are independent. Toxicological analysis is routine in suspicious cases. The Shipman Inquiry of 2004 prompted by the crimes of Harold Shipman, a general practitioner who murdered at least 215 of his patients over a 23-year period, led to sweeping reforms in the regulation of controlled drugs, the monitoring of death rates, and the governance of medical practice. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. We still trust our doctors. We still take the pills they prescribe, swallow the medicines they compound, accept the reassurances they offer. We do so because we must, because the alternative is a world in which every consultation is shadowed by suspicion and every prescription is an act of faith too frightening to make. Palmer's case reminds us, with a quietness more unsettling than any shout, that trust is not the same as safety, and that the distance between healing and harm is measured not in miles but in intention. Let us return one last time to where we began. November 1855. A room on the first floor of the Talbot Arms. The candles are burning low. The bedsheets are disordered, stained with sweat. The body of John Parsons, cook, has been removed. The doctor has gone home, across the street, through his own front door, into the house where his son sleeps and his mother-in-law's ghost inhabits the parlour, and the memory of his wife lingers in the curtains she chose and the carpets she walked upon. The room is empty now. On the bedside table, a glass of water half drunk. Beside it, the small box that held the pills open, its contents gone. On the floor, perhaps, a smear of something that might be spilled medicine or might be nothing at all, just a shadow cast by the guttering flame. Through the window, the house opposite, Palmer's house, with its brass plate and its consulting room and its respectable facade. A lamp burns in a first-floor window. He is still awake. What is he thinking? About Cook? Unlikely. About money? Almost certainly. About the horses running at Doncaster next month, or the bill from Pratt that falls due at Christmas, or the letter from the insurance company that he has not yet opened. About Anne, her face, her voice, the way she looked at him on their wedding day. About the children, 4 small coffins, 4 patches of turned earth in the churchyard. About his mother, who loved him with a ferocity that no evidence of his wickedness could diminish. We do not know. That is the final truth about William Palmer. We do not know what lay behind the smile. We never did. Perhaps no one ever did. Perhaps not even the man himself. 4 things remain to be said. The first concerns the mask. Palmer smiled when he courted Anne. He smiled at the bedside of the dying cook. He smiled in the dock at the Old Bailey. He smiled, or so numerous contemporary accounts report, as he stepped onto the scaffold. We never saw his face without the smile. No one did. It is possible that the mask was so perfectly fitted, so seamlessly bonded to the skin beneath, that the man and the mask became indistinguishable, that Palmer no longer knew where the performance ended and the self began. There are people like this. They are not monsters. They are something more disturbing. They are hollow, and the hollowness is invisible because the surface is so beautifully maintained. A well-kept house with no one home. The second concerns knowledge. The same formulas, the same compounds, the same measuring scales. One set of hands uses them to cure, another to kill. Palmer did not need a secret laboratory or a forbidden grimoire. He needed only what any competent surgeon of his era possessed, a working knowledge of pharmacology and access to a chemist's shop. The pills he rolled for Cook were made with the same care, the same technique, the same professional dexterity as the pills he rolled for his legitimate patients. The difference was invisible. And that invisibility is the most frightening thing about him, because it means that the instruments of healing are always, already, the instruments of destruction. The choice between them is made in silence, in solitude, in a place that no regulation can reach and no oversight can penetrate. The third concerns the gambling. Palmer was not born a murderer. He was born a gambler. The racecourse taught him the most dangerous of all illusions, that you can get it back, that the next bet will be the last, that the next windfall will clear the slate. It is a lie that gambling whispers to everyone who sits down at the table, and Palmer sat down young and never found the strength to rise. Each debt led to a scheme. Each scheme led to a death. Each death led to money. Each sum of money led back to the racecourse. The circle was perfect and inescapable, a wheel that turned faster with every revolution until it flew apart, taking with it not only the gambler, but everyone unfortunate enough to stand within reach of the wreckage. The fourth concerns memory. Rugeley was never renamed. The house still stands. The inn still stands. 30 meters of road separate them, the same 30 meters that Palmer crossed, night after night, carrying pills in his pocket and a smile on his face. If you were to walk that road on a November evening, when the Staffordshire drizzle hangs in the air and the street lamps tremble in the mist, you would see nothing. No ghosts, no shadows, no trace of what happened here. Only a quiet English street, unremarkable in every respect, on which a doctor once lived and practiced, and was well liked by everyone who knew him. A good doctor. Everyone said so. The candle in the window of the house on Market Street flickers once, twice, and goes out. The light in the window goes dark. This has been the story of William Palmer, surgeon, sportsman, husband, father, forger and poisoner, born on the 6th of August 1824 in Rugeley, Staffordshire, and hanged on the 14th of June 1856 at Stafford Jail, before a crowd of 30,000. He was 31 years old. He was convicted of one murder. He may have committed many more. He left behind a son who lived to 78 and never escaped his father's shadow. A mother who called him saintly, a town that tried to change its name, a law that bears his name still, a wax effigy in a museum of horrors that smiled at visitors for 100 years, and a question, the oldest, simplest, most unanswerable question that one human being can ask about another. How could he? The room is empty. The pills are gone, the hands are still, but the question remains.